Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of LV Podcast. Today, we are having a conversation about impact investments, and for the same, we have invited Mr. Srikrishna Ramamoorthy from Unitus Seed Fund, who has been actively involved in this sector. To interview him, we have Mr. Madan Padaki, co founder of OneBridge and Head Held High Foundation. Without taking much of your time, I'll quickly leave it over to you guys now to start the conversation.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Wonderful to be on this podcast with Let's Venture. My name is Madan Padaki. I'm the founder and CEO of OneBridge, a social enterprise that is creating jobs in rural India by converting youth as entrepreneurs and helping them deliver a variety of services to local consumers. It's been a long journey of 10 years with the foundation that I'm a part of called the Head Held High, now morphing into OneBridge as a social enterprise, all with the objective of creating livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods in rural India. That's a quick bit about me. Delighted to be in this conversation with Sri. When the Let's Venture guys said, hey, why don't you do a podcast and you get to ask questions to a impact investor, I said, rarely does one get to question the impact investor. And that's how I jumped at this opportunity. So Sri, you're in the hot seat today. Wonderful to have you with us. Why don't you just give a quick background of who you are, what Unitus is, how did you land up in the impact space?
Sure, it's good to be chatting with you, Madan. We don't usually, like you said, get to do this where you're asking a lot of the questions. My name is Srikrishna. I'm with Unitus Seed Fund. We are India's leading impact seed fund, investing into businesses that serve the masses. The areas that we invest in are healthcare, education, and fintech. And we've been doing this since 2012 when we set up the first fund. And we're currently investing out of our second fund, which is a 300 crore fund. And we're looking to invest in up to 25 new companies over the course of the next few years. Both for Unitus as well as for myself, a lot of this started with microfinance. Today, microfinance has shown that you could be creating large-scale impact and generating strong profits and returns for your investors by providing financial services to a segment of the society that doesn't have access to it. And what we're doing at Unitus Seed Fund is taking a lot of what we've learned in microfinance in the early days and fulfilling the need that low-income consumers or folks at the bottom of the pyramid have around other sectors like healthcare, education, access to things beyond credit, etc. So that's really how things have evolved both for me and for Unitus Seed Fund. And from the first fund that we raised in 2013, we've made 23 investments and we've created a sizable amount of impact. Up until now, through our portfolio companies, we've impacted over 1 million lives in India. And when we say impacted 1 million lives, it means someone's either been able to access a healthcare service or someone's been able to access a supply chain intervention that's enabled access to better quality of inputs or access to higher levels of income and those sort of things. And I'll tell you more as we go along.
Great. So in a way, that's what you're defining as the impact of the impact investment that you do, and you're defining it in the three sectors: healthcare, education, and livelihood creation. Can you go a little deeper in terms of, so what would you define as impact? You said you impacted 1 million lives. So if you were to just take a view as of now and then fast forward 5 years hence, what is the real impact that you guys want to make in the country through the investments that you make?
Sure. I think the best way to answer that ends up being using examples from our own portfolio companies.
Yeah.
And I'll maybe talk about 2 or 3 and then take it from there. One of our earliest investments is a company called Hippocampus.
Mm-hmm.
Hippocampus runs kindergartens in villages. So it's the same quality of education that a child would get in an urban setting, but Hippocampus does it in villages where the population is anywhere between 5,000 to 15,000 people, and they do it at a price point of between 200 to 300 rupees per month per child. They're in close to 300 centers just in South India alone, largely Karnataka, expanding them now into other parts of India. And over 75% of their centers get to profitability fairly quickly at the center level. And each center would have up to 40 to 45 children. They hire a woman from the same village or a neighboring village who's usually a high school graduate, train her to be a kindergarten teacher, and then she's up and running the center. So that's and the impact really comes from I think in today if you look at reports that Asar and others put out, Children that are in grade 7 are only at grade 2 or grade 3 reading level. And hippocampus goal is to make sure that by the time children are in grade 4, they're at the grade appropriate learning level. So that's where the impact comes from. While at a broad level, it's how many children that are enrolled in the center, and that's now I think getting close to 20,000 odd children. But as you drill deeper into how the impact is getting created, that's where it comes from. But fundamentally, it's a business that's focusing on providing high quality education services in rural India. That's the way one would look at it. Another of our investments is a company called DriveView. DriveView is an on-demand driver service for your personal car. So think of the likes of the on-demand taxi aggregators where you pull up an app and order a cab. Here you pull up an app and you order a driver for your car. And again, they're doing many thousand rides a month in 4 cities or 5 cities now in India, and scaling quite nicely. And the impact comes from the fact that they're bringing in people that are either drivers and looking for a job, or they're drivers and they're employed with someone, but they have a fair bit of downtime and they're on DriveView and they're increasing income levels. Or you're an electrician or a plumber by day, but you know how to drive, and by accessing the app and it's a marketplace that connects you with the customer. So again, they're seeing driver incomes in a number of situations almost double, but in a lot of others go up at least by 50 to 60% on a monthly basis. And again, the business model is fairly simple. You pay somewhere between 100 to 125 rupees per hour and to DriveView, and DriveView parts with I think 75-80% of that to the driver, and they keep the rest, like any other marketplace type of model. And again, the income, and they're also providing health insurance to their better performing drivers. They've got training tie-ups on basic customer service and the like. So that's again where at the broad level impact is on how many drivers on the platform and how they're enhancing income levels. But as you go deeper, there's also other things that are getting provided to the driver. So that would be a second that sort of broadly falls into the livelihood bucket
category.
But at the same time, the argument that a lot of people make, and I'm guessing this is also something that everyone wonders about impact investing, is when you look at DriveView, you're like, this is an investment that sort of any traditional venture firm could have also made. And if you're saying DriveView is an impact investment, then so is Uber, Ola, Swiggy, and all these other guys as well. And I think the nuance there is, what was the entrepreneur's vision for this business when they built it, and at some level, what's the intent, and how is that translating on the ground into how do they care about the employee, or how do they care about the constituent that they want to impact. I think it's those aspects which come in, and that's what we look for as a criteria when you're looking at an entrepreneur and deciding. So in many ways, I think we're not necessarily very different from traditional venture firms in terms of the rigor of analysis or the kind of things that we would look for. We look for market rate returns from every investment that we make, but impact is something that we define very well, and it's something that we care about. And the way we look at it is we look for business models where the impact is built into the business model. So then as the business scales, the impact will also scale along with that. And fundamentally, as like any other venture fund, if the business doesn't scale and grow, you've probably neither achieved impact nor achieved the financial success that you want.
Interesting. So brings me to another question, and I think that's where what you said clarifies, but would love to get to a little more detail. So if I'm an entrepreneur and I say, hey, is my business impact or is it non-impact? The example of DriveView could have been built by completely in a different model by another entrepreneur without even considering the impact of what they're doing, right? Whereas this entrepreneur that you backed has a certain vision. So how do I, as an entrepreneur, determine whether my business is impact or not impact, and therefore make the decision to approach you guys or not approach you guys?
Tough one. So I think fundamentally as an impact investor, what we are trying to first look at is, does the business model that you're doing, is that fundamentally sound? And that lens is no different as from any other investor. The next level of assessment that we would do as we're evaluating the business is, does the unit economics of this business lend itself in a way that you could be serving that low income consumer or that mass segment of, bottom of the pyramid as it's called. So we get pitched all the time by entrepreneurs of all hues.
All times, yeah.
And what we're most interested in, beyond of course the basics of the business model being sound and making sense, the opportunity and all of that, what we're most interested in and what we care about ends up being, does the unit economics of the model support the business in the longer term to be able to go after the base of the pyramid. And if an entrepreneur is able to demonstrate that, that's what makes it interesting for someone like us. So that would be sort of an indirect way of how an entrepreneur should think of it, because a lot of businesses today could be serving consumer segments, across tiers.
Right.
And it's very true with technology businesses, because technology doesn't discriminate. An ATM doesn't care if you're an HNI or if
Correct.
if you're a microfinance borrower.
Right.
But what the crux there ends up becoming that, with time, and in a country like India, the opportunity is clearly at the bottom of the pyramid, because the top gets saturated fairly quickly. So then how's the entrepreneur thinking of going after that segment, and does the business model allow for itself over a period of time to get there? So that's an assessment I think that we are looking for when we make an investment, and we're fine if, from what's been demonstrated so far by a startup that's pitching to us, we're fine if what's been demonstrated is some of it is focusing on the consumer segment we care about, but the entrepreneur is clear in their thinking that that's really where they want to focus much more on, and over a period of time, 80-90% of whatever is the business that they're doing caters to that segment. I think that's the way we would look at it, and perhaps that's what differentiates an impact investor from a traditional venture firm. There's also that element of a little bit of patient capital, as it's called, knowing that some of these businesses take longer and they're longer gestation. Like for example, a business running kindergartens in rural India is almost like building infrastructure.
Right.
Or we have another investment in a company that has a handheld breast cancer screening device, and that scale will really come when they're able to screen women in large numbers in rural India or in rural parts of other emerging economies. And some of those will take time, because you don't necessarily already have a distribution network that goes in that deep yet. I mean, one is hoping that OneBridge will answer that, or will solve that. But that some of those things
Correct.
take time, and I think it's also a question of timing. Today, you're seeing a lot more opportunity emerge and access emerge simply because of the proliferation of internet, mobile internet, Aadhaar, the entire India Stack framework.
Yeah.
A number of these other enablers that didn't exist, say, 5-10 years ago, and does so now. So I think that's the way we would look at it.
So what I hear you saying is three things. One, you're saying, hey, the why of what you're doing is critical to us. Your heart should be in the right place. You should explicitly say that this is the impact that I want to create. Two, the consumer segment that you serve has to be the base of the pyramid segment, right? Largely. Even if you start from the bottom, from the top, you should have an intent to say that this is how I'll broad base my service. And three, you must have a business model that will support the first two.
Absolutely.
Because without the third, however good the intent and the mass market product is, obviously you'll wear your financial hat in category 3, evaluate and say, hey, this model does not support.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
In your experience, typically, I'm just saying, if you meet 10 entrepreneurs, how many do you think you say, hey, fit the first one, I tick all the 10 on parameter 1, which is heart in the right place, wanting to do the right thing. How many of them have a product that serves mass market, and how many of them really think have a business model that supports that whole rollout? What's your...
So I think the stat is the same with like it is in general.
Yeah.
So I think I'd say 1 out of 10 would be interesting, but not because of items 1 and 2, because of item 3. Right. A lot of what you see today is still business models that haven't been well thought through on the fundamentals of the business itself.
Right.
Now, assuming that you've gotten past item 3 first, which is what we would do, I think then trying to find folks that are where you're able to checkbox 1 and 2 becomes a narrower set, but it's changing. You're seeing a lot more people realize, and that's simply coming from the fact that there is such an opportunity today, and there's a bunch of plumbing that's happening that you can access that consumer segment.
Exactly.
But I think at the same time, from having seen more than a few thousand, from having met and interacted, or at least looked at least 3,000 business plans, and anything that we bring into our pipeline needs to have some semblance of, okay, this looks somewhat interesting for us. So if it's a company that's doing enterprise SaaS for a US client, it's not even going to come into our pipeline.
Exactly.
Right. So from that subset, I'd say we've looked at 3,000 odd plans up until now. We've made close to 30 investments, so that's the yield.
Wow.
And I think it's also around a lot of these businesses are tough businesses, and so if one's got the ability to execute and the skill set, not everyone is thinking of solving tough problems today.
Exactly.
There are easier things to go after, so why not try that? But it's changing. The people that have gone there, tried that, been successful, are now coming and saying, hey, let me take on the next big challenge. And I think you're a classic example of that.
I think it's an interesting one because when I moved from Manipal to High and subsequently to OneBridge, a lot of people ask me saying, so how do you define yourself as a social enterprise? What is the difference? I struggled with that answer for a couple of years, trying to figure out what is different. Of course, the heart was always there. I think I've come to the belief that there's nothing called as a social enterprise. In my worldview, there's an enterprise and there's an anti-social enterprise, not the other way around. So which means, comes back to your point, see, that if you embed the impact deep within your organization, and as you scale commercially, the impact naturally scales. In my view, that's how all businesses ought to be.
Exactly. That's because it's good for all stakeholders.
It's good for all stakeholders rather than saying, I'll do only money. But it's a damn tricky thing, trying to get that model.
Correct. No, bang on.
Right.
So if you ask my colleague Will Poole, who's one of the founders of Unitus Seed Fund, along with the rest of us, his view is, and he's has been a successful entrepreneur and now an investor, and his view is he wants to leave behind a world where his grandchildren don't have to even realize that there existed something called impact investing at one point in time.
Exactly.
Because the belief is all businesses should be impact and should be run in this fashion.
Exactly.
Because that's what will enable success at a broad level.
Absolutely. And that's where I think the inclusive development agenda that we need to pursue, that thought process has to really seep in strongly.
And the view that, I guess, and it's the choice that we've made, if you look at the spectrum of impact investing, the choice that we've made is we want to be in the bucket where we're generating high returns and high impact. So it's a choice that we've made on looking at high impact, high returns, and it is a spectrum. There are people that say, I'm fine taking lower returns.
Exactly.
All I care about is the impact that's being created. I think eventually with time, it goes back to the business model being inherently sound, and that lending to everything else.
Right. Terrific. So let's assume, and so we've covered what do you look for. Now, what happens after you put in the money, right? As an entrepreneur, the journey is a lot of choices that one needs to make, right? There are choices that have high impact, but maybe in the gray zone of financial returns.
Sure.
There are choices which are clearly yielding high financial returns, but negatively impact the impact that one needs to create. As a board member, once you put in the money and assume that you're on the board, how do you help the entrepreneur stay honest to the cause that you've invested in? And what are the dilemmas that you face while doing so?
This is a tricky one. And my straight answer to your question on if there comes a point where there's a trade-off, and I use the word trade-off broadly, I think it really comes down to, look, we're at a point where it's not generating the kind of impact yet that we know we can. And we're faced with this choice where we can now scale the business very rapidly by going after consumer segments that are higher and higher, because it's far easier to access that consumer segment. It's less effective, less expensive, more cost effective. That segment is already on Facebook or whatever that be, right? I think the direction in which the entrepreneur tends to go is, look, this is what I'll have to go after, the segment where the money is, simply because if I don't do that, then I'm putting the entire business at risk. So whatever little impact I have created is also going to go away. So I think those conversations and those tough decisions largely then tend towards, fine, let's pause on what we said we would do on the impact piece for now, and let's go after the what makes business sense and make a commitment that we'll revisit this in some span of time. But and that's fine, because we know that the intent of the entrepreneur to do this was always there, and we're clear that that hasn't gone away.
Correct.
And it's also baked into the agreements and all that we do, but those are honestly secondary.
Yeah.
Right? It's the intention and the genuineness with which they wanted to pursue that. And as long as we're clear that fundamentally this business model is something where with time the unit economics is going to support that, as I said earlier, we're fine with taking a pause, going after a segment that is not necessarily what we care about, and then coming back to it. And we're honest about it. We tell our investors that here's how this was, or when we tell ourselves as well that if someone were to come and say, hey, how is it played out here? We don't, we're honest about whether that's achieved or not, agree that we'll come back to it. I think where we would, what would probably be something that, I guess if it were a situation where we realized that something was flawed with either the entrepreneur or with the business model, and that's what has led to a situation where it's not creating the kind of impact that we wanted. I think that would be a situation where we would have to then reflect on ourselves and rethink on whether we took the right decision or not. But otherwise, we've not questioned our decision to make that investment, or we say that, hey, this went nowhere. And we've had those examples.
Right.
And we've also seen things then, like for example, something changed where you could far more cost effectively, or some element, change that you can now access that segment in a far better way, and businesses have then come back to pursuing what they said they would.
So from that angle, without of course naming names, what have been your most spectacular failures, and what are the learnings from that?
So I think we've not had anything spectacular yet. Well, the spectacular failures that have happened, or the failures that we've seen in the portfolio, have all been where it's been a write-off on the business, or we've recovered some money, but they still had created impact. Okay. And the business didn't take off for various reasons. Either the space got really hot, and there was so much VC money in that sector that new unfunded startups just didn't get funded, because everyone was saying, oh, how are you going to compete with someone that's raised so much money? Or it was because the entrepreneur wasn't able to execute, which are all reasons that any startup failure happens, right?
Correct.
So have we had a failure where we've given up on something because the impact hasn't been created? I think the answer is no. It still is, because they said, yeah, look, we've tried, we've done a bunch of these things, we're not, the timing is not yet right for us, or there's a lot of times the plumbing is not there for us to access this, but we know that it's on the right side of history. We'll get to it in due course. That's really what has happened. Yeah, no, we've not had a situation where something's been absolutely no impact but has imploded completely, or the other way around. No.
Shri, we've covered your evaluation and entry into a firm, the dilemmas that you face when you're an investor in the firm. Let's get to the exit. Right. So how do you look at exits generally in the space? Right. One is, of course, from a financial standpoint, you need your multi-X return.
8x to 10x return in 4 to 6 years.
Okay, 8x to 10x return in 4 to 6 years. Two is, how do you look at it from an impact standpoint?
Sure.
Right. What is the long-lasting impact that you want to create when you become a part of the firm, and when you exit?
Sure. Like with any other investor, you're investing to exit, and we're investing our investors' capital, so we have to give them a strong return. So the dynamics of that play out no differently from anyone else. From a long-term impact standpoint, I guess the way we look at it is, you've seeded something fairly early, and you laid that foundation for a fundamental way in which this business is running its course, and you hope that stays on, and it's gotten now ingrained into the DNA of the business, and for as long as they're doing what they're doing, the impact that's getting generated just keeps increasing manifold. I think that's the way we would look at it. and that's irrespective of whether we track those numbers or track the metrics, etc. Because once you're not an investor, there is no, while you may stay in touch and all of that, there's probably no reason for them to keep providing you with information. But at a fundamental level, you've ingrained something that's just staying on. And an example that strikes me is more from how it's played out with the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, where I used to work with before and manage their investing portfolio, and they're now an investor in Unitus Seed Fund. They were one of the early investors in microfinance in India. They seed invested in a number of microfinance companies that have today gone on to becoming banks.
Right.
And they're not an investor anymore, but
the impact of what they've done
is very much there.
Very much there.
It's very much there for everyone to see. Obviously, if you were to ask Michael Dell or other folks at the foundation, they're immensely proud of the fact that they've been able to catalyze urban microfinance in India, and they've generated enormous amount of impact just by how many people have been able to get access to credit, not just regular credit, also micro mortgages and a whole variety of services beyond that. And going beyond credit, what else have they been able to access to? And the fact is that both the investments that they've done have also done very well financially, simply because it was a great time for financial services to be sort of getting going in India, and they've proven that through those early investments and a number of other early investors in microfinance as well, they've all proven that this consumer segment is an investable asset class. If you're providing financial services to the underserved, they will pay for it, and they're credit worthy as well. And that's now stayed on, and you have now banks that are willing to service them, and you have hedge funds investing in those banks and saying, yeah, this is a great segment to go after. And I think the way we look at it at Unitus, we're trying to replicate that now in education and in healthcare and in job creation, employability, and the like. So I think that's how one views the sort of impact on the longer term.
So as the journey moves from just an impact investment to actually being mainstream, it brings back that
Correct.
point that you said, that it's no longer only impact.
Correct.
Right. Today, all the banks that they've become actually are in the mainstream.
Correct. And they all started as microfinance companies.
Exactly.
So if you look at 8 of the 10 small finance banks, and Bandhan, which is a commercial bank, all started as microfinance companies. Yeah.
So perhaps that is a journey that one wants to see.
Correct.
Right. When you see something which is at the fringe.
Correct.
How does it become mainstream?
Correct.
So in that context, moving on to the last question. Obviously, a lot of it moving from the fringes to mainstream requires a whole lot of regulatory policy advocacy support. One, at the Unitus Seed Fund itself, do you take up any of those research, any of those projects which will showcase a model of doing something in a different way at the government? And again, at an industry level, at a group level, what are the initiatives?
Sure. As much as you'd like to, unlike you, we have only 24 hours in a day. So there's only that many things that we're able to do. But I think a lot of this needs enablers at the policy level. And particularly when you're working in healthcare, education, you have to interface with the government. And for the startups that we invest in, for them to succeed, you will need either enabling framework or policy that is, at least when they get going, non-interfering but eventually enabling.
Exactly.
And I think a few things and I guess Aadhaar is a great example of that. The fact that there are a number of businesses today that exist because or can do what they're doing because of the framework that Aadhaar has created. It's the same with UPI, for example. A number of ideas that we see today make more sense and can be scalable and sustainable simply because of UPI and stuff like that. So I think in healthcare and education, one would like to see more of that. We're part of a group called the Impact Investors Council, which is essentially an industry body that's working on some of these things around demonstrating the impact of impact investing, doing research to show that look, all of this is working. We need to be able to unlock more of this, be it from the government or from other folks, and also doing advocacy for a number of initiatives that will essentially help the impact investing industry scale and grow on. So there are a number of things that we're doing. At the fund level, it's hard for us to do, but by being part of an industry association, all of this is possible.
Is possible.
And so interfacing with, say, the Niti Aayog or
Right.
with the Ministry of Finance on bringing in change into the way either we operate or frameworks for some of the startups that we operate in that will just enable them to succeed. So
Sure.
those are things that we do.
Sure, great. Any last words of wisdom for our listeners? What do you think as an impact entrepreneur?
I was actually going to flip it and ask you a question. but-
Sure, why don't you do that as well?
I guess I'd flip that and ask you a question from, because you've known Unitus and you've known the space for a while now, but are there things that you would particularly look for from an impact investor as you've now been raising money, and you've raised money of multiple types in the past and through what you're doing at OneBridge and Held High Foundation as well? Things that you've wondered about an impact investor, or things that you would like to see an impact investor change that you think would help entrepreneurs like you?
That's a great question, and it's a wonderful opportunity for me to to address that as well. I think a couple of things, Sri. If I were to look at it not just as Unitus but from the sector perspective. One is this, from an impact investment standpoint, I think everybody in this sector should spend as much time as possible at the grassroots.
I cannot agree more with you.
Right? One of the things that appalls me many times is when I meet people, and I'm not talking about you, when I meet people who say, so when was the last time, and I'll get some 30-minute gyan on this, how rural India is, and it's out here. When is the last time you visited the village? He says, when I was a kid, my grandfather used to be in this posted here, and I used to go there. Right? And of course, there's a lot of reading, but I think, in my view, is that the base of the pyramid, be it urban or rural, is changing so rapidly now that if we don't get a pulse on that, we'll be sitting in our ivory towers in Bangalore or wherever and defining what it should be. That's one part.
Using PowerPoint.
Using PowerPoints, absolutely. What it also does is, especially to entrepreneurs who come to discuss, the feedback that you will provide, at the end of the day, I'm sure, out of the 3,000 that you would have met, you would have given some feedback or the other that would have been valuable to them to say, hey, I went to them, they told me this, not investing, but here are 3 things to look for.
Sure.
And those will redefine the way people. So I want the feedback also to come out.
And be meaningful.
And be meaningful. So independent of whether they get funded or not, it will make a difference to their lives. And lastly, I think this whole aspect of that impact entrepreneur actually being the mainstream, we need to shout more from the rooftops.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Somewhere my sense is, and I might be totally wrong, but the perception that I get is that we're still at the fringes. Right? The impact investing is still in the fringes.
We're one small track in a
In
general
the
startup conference.
Exactly, right? I want it to be flipped around.
Cannot agree more. Yeah.
So how do we, therefore, the work that you do at IIC,
Sure.
or even at individual funds level, we need to celebrate successes much more. We need to celebrate failures even more,
Sure.
so that everybody learns. And somewhere along the way, if we push hard enough, then that whole aspect of that this is the mainstream, everything else is fringe,
Correct.
will be so embedded deeply into the system.
We all look forward to that day.
Fantastic.
Doing our little part.
Yes. So thank you so much. Wonderful
Thanks,
to have
Madan.
this chat.
Enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madan, and thank you, Sri. This has been a wonderful discussion, and we hope to see more support for the impact businesses in the coming years. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. We hold these discussions every month, so if you want to hear about any particular topic or have any questions, do leave your comments. We'll be back next month.